kicking around dust yard, alone around the run. Well, I can see the fire still in your shadow. None of it is gone. You may be a seeker, but I'm a believer, keeping the hope you need. You don't want to load it onto my shoulders to carry all of your fears, but I can dry your tears, 'cause you make it all through the day. Hello, hello everyone. How are you? Hello, hello. And here we are, back with Starting Now. Brr, how many of you are cold tonight? It is definitely cold out there tonight. And we are on chapter 11 in Starting Now, and I have been so excited to see what we're going to get into. Oh no, you just woke up. Uh-oh. Took a little evening nap, did we? Can you hear me all right, Paula? Am I coming through okay? All right, chapter 11. Good. High on enthusiasm, Libby's steps were lighter as she walked into Seattle General. When it rained, it poured, as the proverb went. And it was just as true of good news as bad. First, Sarah had phoned to say that Martha Reed was unhappy with Ben Holmes working on her account. Libby didn't mean to gloat, but she knew she was 10 times the trust and estate lawyer Ben Holmes was. The second bit of positive news came as a complete surprise. Just that morning, Robin had ever so casually mentioned that a friend of hers might have a line on it for Libby. When pressed, Robin had been reluctant to say much more, but she told Libby that she'd give her details when she had them. Although Robin had refused to answer questions, Libby suspected this friend was the very one the prosecutor had set her sights on. Every time Robin mentioned her contact, she looked away, as though she was afraid Libby might read more into it than she intended. Libby couldn't stop smiling. It wouldn't be long now. In 2 minutes, she seemed this long dry period was about to come to an end, and this was in sight. Sharon saw her and smiled. It was the same smile she had the day she insisted Dr. Stone was interested in Libby. Little did Sharon know the real reason he had asked for a private word. "Did Dr. Stone find you?" the nurse asked as soon as Libby entered the nursery. Libby frowned. "No." Her smile grew to the size of a Cheshire cat. "He asked about you again." "Oh, goody." If he had more news along the lines of what he shared last time they spoke, I'd rather not see him, she mused dryly. Then again, he had been on her mind almost non-stop since the day they'd met in the elevator. and then later when he had asked her to coffee. No matter how many times she tried to keep him from her thoughts, he was there. It'd been a long time since she had been this strongly attracted to a man. It irritated her that she felt drawn to Philip Stone. She didn't even like him. He was arrogant and rude, and yet he cared enough about a young girl to risk approaching Libby with his concern. Hi, Sarah. How are you, hon? That couldn't have been easy. He hasn't been to the gym in a while. If he wanted to talk to me, all he had to do was show up there, Libby said, thinking out loud. That's easily explained, Sharon said. His rotation for the operating room changed at the first of the month. He is last week, so if he hasn't been following his regular workout schedule, that's probably why. Oh, she hated to admit it, and she would not to anyone, not even Robin. But the fact was that she missed seeing him. She wanted to tell Philip how she handled the situation with the girls and get his reaction. And truth be told, she was looking to feed this attraction. Yes, he has a great body, and he was looking good. Robin called him hot stuff. And that was all well and good, but it was more than that. She appreciated what he had done, and gradually her opinion of him had started to change. She had heard from Sharon and the other nurses how deeply Dr. Stone cared for his tiny patients and their parents. Despite herself, Libby found herself wishing she would run into him. The last time Libby had felt like this was in college, when she first met Joe while waitressing. Joe's personality was completely the opposite of Philip Stone's. Joe was funny and outgoing. He was the kind of guy everyone wanted at their party simply because he was so likable. Part of his charm came from his large, chaotic family. After Timmy was killed, Libby had been raised as an only child. She had been fascinated by the bantering exchange between Joe and his siblings. Family gatherings were noisy, chaotic affairs, with babies crying, children madly racing through the house. The men gathered around either the television or the barbecue, and the women congregated in the kitchen, exchanging recipes or housekeeping tips. Libby had felt completely out of place, and she had often sat in the corner on her visits to his house, unaccustomed to the noise and the pandemonium. She still loved it. She missed spending holidays with his family even more than she missed Joe. Well, Dr. Stone wants to see you, Sharon said, looking pleased with herself, as if she was solely responsible for matchmaking the two. Rather than continue this unsettling conversation, Libby looked at the newborns lined up in the rows in the nursery. There had been a full moon, and Sharon had warned her that there were always more births at such times. The nurse had been right, because Libby had yet to see this many newborns at one time. But then again, she had been a volunteer for only a short while. You're very good, you know, Sharon mentioned, reaching for a chart. Libby paused. With the babies? Sharon set the chart down and looked at her. You're a natural. I've watched you. The first couple of times I could tell you weren't accustomed to holding an infant, she smiled, as though reliving the memory. It was almost as if you were afraid that you were going to break, and then after a while you relaxed and started to. The transformation in you was amazing, really amazing. Libby was too tongue-tied to respond right away. I remember my mother singing to me. The memories were fleeing. She had been sick with strep throat, Libby recalled, and her fever had raged for 2 days. It had hurt so much to swallow. Back then, test results took 24 hours. Now, from what she understood, it took only a few minutes to diagnose strep throat. But when she was young, it had time to grow the culture. Her mother had the edge of Libby's bed under the pink canopy and gently brushed the wet hair from her fevered brow and sang her to sleep. If Libby closed her eyes, she could almost hear her mother's angelic voice. Sharon's words made a deal. Thank you, Libby whispered. The nurse was right. In the beginning, it had felt awkward to hold these tiny babies. This morning, as she walked to the hospital, Libby realized how eager she was to spend time with the precious newborns. Do you have any children? Sharon asked. Libby looked away and shook her head. You should. You'd make a wonderful mother. Her throat thickened and she moved toward one of the cribs rather than let her friend know how deeply the words had touched her. Well, Sharon continued at the end of a sigh, I better get busy. I'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, her voice sounded strange. Libby realized, and she was grateful when Sharon didn't comment. Libby picked up the 7-pound baby girl with the surname Knight. She had a small pink bow clipped to a tiny patch of hair. Kissing the infant's brow, Libby smiled into the rocker, as if the infant was aware of everything taking place around her. Baby Knight stared up at Libby. She sang a melody of Barry Manilow hits until the baby yawned and her eyelids drooped closed. After several minutes, Libby replaced her in the tiny bed. The baby directly across from Baby Knight let out a lusty cry, as if demanding her attention. Libby turned and looked at him and smiled when she saw his surname, Wilson. She picked him up and gently cradled him in her arms as she returned to the rocking chair. He wasn't easily comforted, and he arched his back, screaming at the top of his lungs. My, aren't you a hot-headed one, she whispered. Placing him over her shoulder, she rubbed his back, and sure enough, he burped. Libby laughed softly and continued to rock him. Holding these babies in her arms, her head and heart flooded with regrets. She had wished she had worked harder at saving her marriage. In the end, Libby had been convinced she and Joe would never be happy together. Each of them wanted the other person to be something they were not. At the time, it had just seemed best to walk away. Now, holding these babies in her arms, Libby was left to wonder what might have happened if they stayed together. Gone to a counselor, worked out their differences. If she had, perhaps the infant in her arms would be her own, their baby. That would never happen now, and sadness filled her heart. If she could turn back time, Libby realized she might have made different choices. The divorce seemed like an easy way out for what had become a strained and difficult relationship. With these thoughts circling in her mind, Libby glanced up and froze. Her heart shot to her throat and remained lodged there with locked eyes with the man on the other side of the nursery window. Joe Wilson, her ex-husband? How was this possible? Had her imagination conjured him up? He looked real. In fact, he looked as shocked as she did. Standing, she replaced the little boy in the crib and walked out of the nursery. Joe stood by the door when she opened it. What are you doing here? He asked, frowning. That's my son. I volunteer here at the hospital. I had no idea he was your baby. He paced the area in front of the window. You volunteer at the hospital, he asked, as if he found it unbelievable. 2 or 3 days a week? What happened with Burkhart, Smith, and Crandall? They laid me off. It hurt to admit it, but Joe deserved the truth. Laid you off? His voice registered shock. You've got to be kidding me. No one worked the hours you did. She didn't say anything. You didn't make partner? She shook her head. I don't think I even came close. He frowned as if he found that unbelievable and then shook his head. Libby knew what he was thinking because she had the same thought herself just moments before. It went without saying that she had given up a whole lot for very little return. All she needed to do was look inside the nursery at the baby she held so briefly in her arms to realize the sacrifices she'd made. She felt numb and her head was buzzing. A tight constriction gripped her throat, but she managed to squeak out, "Congratulations on your son." He nodded. "Maureen and I feel very blessed." She swallowed against the knot in her throat. "I'm happy for you. I really mean that." "I know you do." Joe's eyes held hers, and he offered her a gentle smile, and then reached out and squeezed her shoulder. I better get back," she said in a rush, for fear she was about to break down in front of him. "Yeah, obviously he was as much of a loss as she was." "It was good to see you, Joe," she said, opening the door. Her hand shook so badly she had a difficult time getting her identification badge into the slot so the door would open. "You too," he said. Once inside, Libby leaned against the wall. She hung her head and drew in a couple of deep, stabilizing breaths in order to get a hold of herself. This was so unlike her. Both level-headed and patient, she was known for her ability to deal with a crisis without allowing her personal feelings to get the best of her. Well, they had got the best of her now. Or the worst, she wasn't sure which. To her acute embarrassment, she realized that if something didn't happen quickly, she was going to dissolve into tears. Libby was not a crier. She couldn't remember the last time she had wept in public. High school, maybe? She planted her hand over her mouth and walked blindly into the nursery, pausing at Sharon's desk. Thankfully, the other woman was out of the room. Libby grabbed hold of the edge, struggling, gritting her teeth, not breathing, determined to get a grip. The nursery door opened and she stiffened. Just look, Sharon was back. She wasn't about to let anyone see her like this, and she looked towards the ceiling. "Libby." It wasn't Sharon. It was Dr. Stone. Why, oh, why did it have to be him? "I was hoping to have a chance to talk to you," he said from behind her. Libby refused to turn around. "Another time." Somehow she managed to eke out the words. All she wanted was for him to leave. He was the last person in the world she wanted to speak to right now. Okay. But he didn't leave. Instead, he stayed right where he was. Libby wanted to shout at him to just go away. Why did he linger when she was so badly wanted him gone? "I have a feeling something's wrong here." She wondered sarcastically if all men were intuitive. "Please, would you just go?" Instead, he stepped closer. "Leave me alone," she demanded between gritted teeth. Fire in her words and in her spirit. Then, to her absolute horror, the dam broke and she burst into tears. She whirled around, intent on leaving the nursery. If he insisted on staying, then fine. What she didn't realize was how close he was behind her, and she abruptly bumped into him. That was all it took. Unable to stop herself, she buried her face in his chest and cried. The room filled with the sound of her heart-wrenching sobs. Her entire upper body shook with the force of her tears. Uh, Philip's arms remained at his sides. Then he bounced his hand against the top of her shoulder a couple of times. I'm sure it isn't that bad. The words sounded stiff and awkward, as if he didn't know what to say. Unable to hold back the sobs, the grief, and the profound sense of loss, her knees started to give way. She might have collapsed to the floor if Dr. Stone hadn't caught her. He wrapped her in his arms. Libby tried to break away, but he held her fast against him, and his voice turned soft and kind. It'll be all right, he whispered. Whatever it is, it will all work out. Anything else might have been able to resist, but not gentleness. Philip held a sobbing woman in his arms. He didn't know what had happened to cause this meltdown, and Libby was in no condition to tell him. Through the years, he had dealt with plenty of emotional women, but the context was completely different. He had on his doctor hat, and they were mothers worried about their children. He would hand them tissues and say what he could to reassure them, filling in the medical details they needed to know. He would never embrace them, not the way he was holding on to Libby. She clung to him, her arms around his waist, her face buried in his chest, as she released what appeared to be years of stockpiled tears. She sobbed as violently as if it were the end of the world, as if nothing was left for her to live for, and she had lost everything that would ever be precious. The need to comfort her overwhelmed him, and he pressed his cheek to the crown of her head. It had been awkward at first, seeing her cry like this. He had had his chance. She had asked him to leave, and by all that was right, he should have taken his cue and vacated the nursery. Instead, he found it impossible to walk away. He wasn't good at this. He didn't know what to say, and he had managed a few hack-eyed words that he doubted she even heard. That was probably for the best. Shh, shh, he whispered, rubbing his hand over the back of her head, wanting to comfort her, needing to comfort her. My ex-husband, she said, the words muffled against his chest. He was here. Philip was beginning to imagine what might have happened. She nodded her forehead, rubbing against. I held his son. You're still in love with him. No, the lone word, alone, she nearly shouted. Okay, sorry, you aren't in love with him. He's married. He has a son. Philip tried to follow her, knowing he wasn't always the most intuitive man around. I'm sorry, she blubbered, breaking away. I have to go. Really, I need to go. Abruptly, she turned away from him and nearly stumbled. Philip would have stopped her if he had known what to say. But like before, he could not think clearly. Libby had grabbed her purse and was gone. Oh my, and that is the end of our chapter 11. A full-on meltdown in front of Dr. Stone. But like I said, I have a feeling these two are beginning to fall in love. I just know it. I just know it. I'm going to get a drink, and I'll be right back, you guys. Tell me what you think of the story so far. Wasn't chapter 11 excellent? I knew something happened. I'll be right back. All right. Oh, let's move on to chapter 12. Oh, my. I just love a good book, don't you? I can't believe. All I know, he got remarried, he has a son, and she held his child. I mean, I think Philip Stone was right about one thing. She had years of pent-up tears that when she found out it was his son and that he's married and happy, they have a baby, I just think all her years of pent-up tears came pouring out. Chapter 12. Still shaken, Libby returned to her condo, sank into her sofa, and buried her face in her hands. It felt as if her entire world had crumbled at her feet. Seeing Joe and his son had been devastating, bringing into stark reality every single regret she had been struggling with lately. To make everything 10 times worse, Philip Stone had witnessed it all, to break down in front of him of all people. Libby wanted to crawl into bed, pull the covers over her head, and hibernate for the next 10 years. Philip Stone was a complete enigma. On the one hand, he was both rude and arrogant, and on the other hand, he had been gentle, caring, and kind. As far as Libby was concerned, he was the perfect candidate for intense, deep, emotional therapy. He was the doctor, all right. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Two completely different people. The first was infinitely easy to dislike and distrust and ignore. The second made her want to bury herself in the comfort of his arms and let him hold her for the next 20 years. Just thinking about the way she had melted down in front of him caused her acute embarrassment. She'd never be able to look at him in the face again. This couldn't be happening. It just couldn't. Only it was. Sucking in a deep breath to center herself, sat upright and squared her shoulders. She reached for her knitting. She discovered that holding the needles and yarn calmed her, although her hands trembled and she was forced to catch a sob or two. She managed to complete the entire row without an error. The baby blanket was the most difficult project she had tackled. She wasn't even sure why she had chosen to knit it. It seemed like a good idea at the time. No shaping, no need to sew it together. Once she finished, Lydia had one knitted up for display, and Libby had been drawn to it. The progression from the preemie hats to the blanket had seemed natural. Like the hats, the blanket would most likely be given to charity. After knitting for an hour, Libby's nerves had relaxed, but only a little. Every time her mind took her to an uncomfortable place, she forced her thoughts in a different direction. She refused to entertain a single flashback of her failed marriage or what had happened with Philip that afternoon. To do so would only upset her more, and she was distressed enough. What a mess she had made of her life. Her doorbell chimed her musings. It was so rare to get company that all Libby did was stare at the front door. By the time she stood, the doorbell had rung a second time. Apparently, whoever was on the other side was impatient. "Hold on," she said. Checking the peephole, she gasped and rolled away from the door, flattening her back and her hands against the wall. Philip Stone. "Libby," he called. "I know you're in there. Open up." Biting into her lower lip so hard she almost broke the skin, she twisted the deadbolt and opened the door. "What are you doing here?" she demanded with great bravado. Her heart felt as if it was about to explode. At this rate, she would... The pages to unstick are hard. She would never need to exercise again. All she needed to do was raise her pulse. Was Philip Stone. "Nice to see you too. Are you going to invite me inside?" Keeping her hand on the doorknob, she moved out of the way. 3 feet into her condo, paused, and looked. Wow, look at the pages, you guys. Some of the words are missing. So if I hesitate, it's because the words... I've never had a book where the words were completely gone. Philip, yeah, nice view. Certain he hadn't stopped by to gaze. Yeah, look at that, y'all. Completely gone. There's no words there. It's like the printer didn't print them. I'll just go to the next line. He was bossy, too. Libby shut the door and leaned against it, needing the support. "Why are you here?" she asked for a second time. "To be perfectly frank, I haven't figured that out myself." He walked over to the couch and sat in the very spot he had so recently vacated. "As you can see, I'm fine. I apologize for the emotional display, but I'm in control now." "Good," he hesitated and then commented. "When I get upset, I usually have a shot of good whiskey." "Not my thing," Libby told him, cringing at the thought. She had a bottle of wine in the refrigerator, but frankly, she wasn't in the mood. Not knowing what to say, Libby claimed the chair across from him and pressed her two hands between her knees. The silence felt awkward and strained. She was content to wait him out. Eventually he'd get bored and leave. At least, that is what she hoped. Finally, he couldn't stand it any longer. "Did you stop by to embarrass me even more?" He arched his brow as though her question surprised him. "No, I came to make sure you made it home all right." "As you can see, I did." That didn't appear to satisfy him. "You want to tell me what happened back there?" "No." Libby had no intention of explaining what led up to that dreadful scene. She embarrassed herself enough for one day, and she wasn't about to eat the performance. Besides, blurted out more than she intended earlier. "I believe I've already..." Actually, she had told him more than she was comfortable admitting. Leaning forward, he set his elbows on his knees and rubbed his palms together. "I'm not normally like this," Libby blurted out. Naturally, she had been upset before. Losing her position with the law firm had been traumatic. but it hadn't caused her to throw herself into a man's arms and sob out. Let me put it this way. I am usually able to control my emotions. Today was an exception. Good to know. She had been on the verge of calming down when Philip Stone had arrived. Her pulse had returned to an even rhythm, and she managed to herd her thoughts away from the keen embarrassment. Now all her emotions threatened to burst free again. I was doing just fine until you came along. Her voice wobbled slightly before she regained control. I see that it's all my fault. Yes, exactly. She smiled in spite of herself. He really was most surprising man. Smiled back. I was worried about you, he said, speaking low. I'm okay now. He leaned forward and reached for her hand. His touch felt cool against her heated skin. How did you know where I live? She asked without looking up. Her phone number was unlisted. I asked Sharon. She had your volunteer form on file. He had been a bit bold about tracking her down, and Sharon already seemed to think that there was something romantic happening between them. Her nurse friend had probably been eager to share the information. Do you regret your divorce? He asked. Libby debated how best to answer that. What I regret was that I didn't try harder to save the marriage. We were both so eager to give up on each other. Joe wanted a family, and I felt we should wait. Then, seeing his baby today, she paused as her throat started to tighten, and she found she couldn't complete the sentence. Libby looked amazed that he was willing to share something so personal with her. What happened today clearly was painful, he continued. But you seem like you're willing to own your part in what caused the divorce. Don't make the mistake of beating yourself up, especially now. You don't have anything to feel guilty about. You didn't have any regrets after your breakup? He laughed softly. Oh, I had plenty. It took a while for me to realize that I had lost perspective. I assumed the hospital would fail to function if I wasn't there to overlook every detail. I've heard Sharon say that several physicians on staff. They have pretty big egos. It happens, he agreed, and smiled. Libby returned it with a wobbly smile of her own. He released her hand and straightened his posture. Have you ever been sailing? He asked out of the blue. Libby remembered the picture on Herschel's credenza, the one of him on the sailboat, and the feeling she had each time she caught a glimpse of it, the sensation of being free and enjoying life. No, but I would like to someday. He stood. No time like the present. Now? She nervously clenched her hands. She had no experience with boats, let alone boating. After the trauma of the afternoon, staying indoors and licking her wounds appealed to her more. Why not? Philip asked. Nibbling on her lower lip, Libby held his gaze, uncertain but tempted. Reading her indecision, he added, when I need to think things over, I head for the marina. Being on the waves clears my head and relaxes me. That was incentive, or it should have been. I'm not sure I should. I've never sailed before, and you'll feel better with the sun on your face and the wind at your back while you're gliding through the water. He made it sound magical. Libby felt a smile coming. Really, what did she have to lose at this point? Nothing about the way she had been living her life seemed to be working. Maybe it was time to stop listening to her first impulses. The decision made, she looked up and met his gaze. Okay, let's do it. An hour later, there they were on Lake Washington, a 24-foot sloop, and when they first arrived at the marina, Philip had gotten busy bringing out the sails, tying them to the mast, and getting everything ready to take them onto the lake. He moved gracefully, comfortably about the boat. Once they had out of the marina, he set the course and raised the sails. Within moments, the mainsail and the jib filled with wind as the Challenger 7.4 sliced effortlessly through the dark green water. Philip had been right. The sun felt good on Libby's face. As the wind whipped about her, it seemed to take away the pain and regrets of the afternoon. She had understood now what Philip had meant when he said he went sailing, when he needed to think something through. Sailing had a calming effect on her, too. Philip seemed completely at ease at the helm. He was confident and sure of himself. The wind ruffled his hair, blowing it back from his face. He looked boyish and happy. Libby found it difficult to stare at him. When he caught her watching him, he grinned. It hardly seemed possible that just that morning she had thought of him as a brisk and unpleasant. The transformation was amazing. "What do you think?" he asked. She didn't know what to say. "It's everything I thought it would be. I can't wait to tell Herschel." A frown briefly marked his brow. "Who's Herschel?" She didn't need to stop. "A friend," Libby said, although she only recently come to think of him as one. A picture of a sailboat on his credentials, and I always wondered why he loved it so. Now I know. Water, traffic, sailboats galore, and motorboats too, their engines roaring as they sped past. A section of the Lake Washington had been condoned off for swimming. Cheers and shouts of youngsters taking advantage of the sunshine rang through the lake afternoon. Even with all the busyness of the lake, Libby felt a strange sense of intimacy with Philip. In the close confines of the boat, her feelings were stronger than ever. While there was sound all around them, the sailboat was surprisingly quiet, making conversation easy. She wondered if Philip felt the connection too, and assumed he must, although neither of them spoke of it. Oh, my. Filling the silence, he talked about the sailing classes he had taken and his search for just the right boat when he decided on the Challenger 7.4, which he kept docked at the marina. After a few minutes, Libby relaxed, and they shared a companionable silence. She closed her eyes and turned her face towards the sun and relaxed, really relaxed. Her tears earlier had been cathartic, and they drained her of all the tension, leaving her free of recriminations. The mainsail caught the wind, and the Challenger sliced through the water like a hot knife through butter. Surprised by the sudden burst of speed, Libby grabbed hold of the side and held on. Philip laughed and motioned for her to come sit by him. "Come here by me," he urged. "I'll teach you to sail." Ah, the desire to learn overweighed her reluctance take over the helm. She settled close to his side, but he held her in front of him, wrapping his arms around her and letting her take hold of the wheel. He explained basic sailing theory, and then the words made little sense. Although she did her best to pay attention, she couldn't ignore the fact that she basically was in his arms. Her mind, her her mind spinning at an incredible speed, trying to take in how quickly her feelings for him, and apparently for her, had changed. Oh, yes, there it is. She's falling in love. This is great. Turning her head, she smiled up at him. You're a natural. She laughed softly, and then, only after a short pause, Philip leaned down and pressed to hers. It was a gentle exploratory kiss that quickly deepened. This man could kiss. Libby strained upward toward him. Her position was slightly uncomfortable, but she didn't care. She continued to hold on to the helm with one hand and slipped her free arm around his neck. The sail went slack, and the flapping noise of the canvas was barely discernible to Libby, but apparently not to Philip. Gradually he broke off the kiss and lifted his head. He took over again, but when Libby went to move, he stopped her. I like having you here. Still flushed and a bit lightheaded, she leaned against him and sat in his embrace for an hour, perhaps longer. Neither of them felt the need to speak. Being this close to Philip felt incredibly good. Every now and again he'd rest his hand against her shoulder or lean down and kiss the side of her neck. When he did, Libby would close her eyes, unable to believe that within the space of a few hours, she had gone from one of the lowest points of her life to such supreme joy. The transformation had happened because of Philip. Eventually they headed back to the marina. Being there makes me hungry, Philip said, as he motored them into the marina slot. How does fish and chips sound? Wonderful. I'm starved. I am too. He helped her off the boat, and they walked together to get the gear down and properly stored. When they wanted to leave, Philip put his arm around her shoulders. Be careful now. These docks get slippery. Around her waist, as though he needed an excuse to keep her close. Oh my. Especially in July, she teased, noticing how dried out the wood seemed to be under the summer sun. Especially in July, Philip echoed, chuckling. She looped around his waist, and together the two of them walked toward the car. This day had certainly been full of surprises. Oh, I knew it. I knew they were going to fall in love. And that takes us to the end of chapter 12. And we are halfway through the book, y'all. Oh, my goodness. Just amazed. I'm telling you, I'm amazed. Falling in love is so great, isn't it? And I had a feeling those two were going to be the connection. They always start out hating the other character, and the other one, boom. Next thing you know, they're falling in love because don't judge a book by its cover. That's right. I want to thank you all for being here for chapters 11 and 12. And I am definitely looking forward to chapter 13 next Wednesday. Same time, same place, y'all. 9 p.m. See you then. Have a very, very good Valentine's weekend, y'all. Stay safe and always, always be kind.